So violence. I work on violence, and more precisely ethno-racial violence in the United States and Europe, including discursive violence, hate speech, nativism, anti-migrant phobia, propaganda, physical violence, police brutality, political violence, protest, urban riots, all these different kinds of violence. There is a vast literature on intergroup conflict. Some studies, for example, focus on socioeconomic factors, trying to understand why there is violence among different groups. So they focus on socioeconomic competition, relative deprivation, the fears that the others, broadly defined, will take job from natives. There are also studies focusing on institutional factors, racist legislation, discrimination, and other studies focus on racial prejudice. The problem is that all these approaches provide very useful insight, but they do not address some very interesting variations. And this the variation I try to explain in my own work. For example, the very famous riots during the 60s. Well, they took place at a time where there is a significant socioeconomic improvement for minorities. Institutional factors. We made a lot of progress in the United States. It's not perfect. We made a lot of progress in Europe, but we don't have a Jim Crow regime. But despite this institutional improvement, we're still facing ethno-racial violence. So other studies focus on racial prejudice, trying to explain everything in terms of racism. And especially on the American side, as you can imagine, it's very, very important. However, all white are not racist. All the racists are not white. There's racism among minorities. There is some tension, for example, between African Americans and African immigrants, or between white and black Hispanic. Furthermore, facing similar adversity, different groups react differently. We are used to now the Black Lives Matter movement, but there is no Hispanic Lives Matter movement, although Hispanic are also killed by the police and they also suffer from discrimination. We didn't have Muslim Lives Matter. After 9/11, they became one of the most targeted minority in the United States and also in Europe. So, building upon all these different approaches, I suggested a different perspective. I think we should try to understand the resilience of ethno-racial violence over time by studying it as part of an identity strategy. Identity strategy in order to secure symbolic and material resources, job opportunities, rights, status, recognition, safety. And actually, this is not new. It started a long time ago. There is a very famous historical example how the Irish became white. We have this assumption that the white were white in the United States from the very beginning. Actually, most white were not perceived as being white by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans. The Irish were not perceived as white, they were perceived as brown. Italians were perceived as brown. So how did they become white? By using violence against other minority, mostly, unfortunately, African American. So since the very beginning of American society, we can identify this relationship between violence as part of adversity, contextual violence, but also violence as a reactive response to violence in order to consolidate one group identity. And this group identity is very important in order to address all these significant variations. In order to address also something very important, we can have at the same time conflict between groups and collaboration between the same groups. So in order to address all these variations, puzzling variation, I focus on identity strategy. And this identity strategy involved perceptions. Perceptions matter. I'm not dismissing the role of contextual factors, but perception matters. Self-perception, perception of the others, perception by the others. The second level, grievances or expectations, because contentious identity politics is not negative in itself. It can be very positive. And I also include contentious protest politics that can involve the use of violence, but sometimes it's mostly based on interracial coalitions. I tend to remain positive. So in my coming book, entitled Violent America, I listed some positive outcomes. For example, the civil rights movement in the 60s. It was not perfect, but it helped to secure some rights for minorities. Affirmative action, this is not perfect, but it tried to limit some damage. And what worked for ethno-racial minorities also worked, at least until the end of the 90s, for other minorities. Feminism, women's rights, other minority, LGBTQ plus rights, and so on. So different minorities became part of these dynamics of contentious politics. The problem is now we are facing the negative aspect of this contentious identity politics with an excessive polarization, excessive racialization of almost everything, even policies that should not be related to race, healthcare, all the debate about the Obamacare in the United States, for example. We also have fragmentation of these interracial coalitions. Feminism now, it's fragmented in the United States, but also in Europe. You have leftist, rightist, white woman, black woman, in terms of religion, in terms of so many different variables. So we have the fragmentation of the entire American society. We have the fragmentation of all these movements that are supposed to help to improve legislation, to make progress towards tolerance. So at the very end of my book, I was, left with one final question. Okay, what's next? And I think the question is important because in Europe, we have concern now that what's going on in the United States, it's coming very soon. So we have populism, we have extreme right-wing movement, that's old vintage in Europe. But we also have this Trumpism, we also have debate, controversy, even in academia, with wokeism, cancel culture and everything, all this important from the United States. So I was left with this question, okay, what can we do? And I suggested at the very end something very simple. This is so simple that, maybe I'm naive, but I think it's time to replace antagonism, just for the sake of it, by agonism. Agonism means social relations based on tolerance, mutual respect, independently from our ethno-racial identification. It's very different from being racially blind. I don't like this notion. No, it's very simple. Is one by one, independently from your group identity, for better or worse. And it's to emphasize tolerance, dialogue, to agree to disagree. That's, I think, it's the most important goal. And I try to remain optimistic about the future of democracy in the United States and also in Europe.